But for 40 years, the kids of those families, whenever they were in a grocery store or a drugstore or whatever, were being exposed to the kinds of books I was just mentioning, Gore Vidal, Norman Mailer, Silent Spring, whatever, along with current bestsellers and genre fiction and so forth. I mean, I grew up in the midst of all this. When I'm talking to science fiction audiences, I talk about how when I was 12 years old in 1971, I bought a extraordinarily avant-garde literary science fiction short story collection called Fun with Your New Head by Thomas M. Dish at the U-Totem convenience store down the road from me in Scottsdale, Arizona. This is unimaginable these days. It's like saying I bought an issue of the Hudson Review at the 7-Eleven. It would not happen. But it was totally routine. The thing about the voracious attached to the periodical distribution system, mass market distribution system, was it would take anything, no matter how good. Why it ended had nothing to do with consumer demand. This is really why I feel that this story falls into the purview of this program. It wasn't that Americans suddenly stopped wanting to be able to buy a broad range of literary and genre and popular and nonfiction and polemical, and trashy and pornographic and whatever books in their grocery store. Yeah. What happened was a big sort of rationalization of retail practices. And the late 80s were the period where a lot of regional supermarket and other similar chains started going national. Albertsons, Safeway, et cetera, et cetera. They were going national, and they were also harnessing much more sophisticated IT to manage their inventories and so forth. And they started asking, why do we want to be dealing with this weird, funky, very locally based magazine and periodical system?
Describe briefly.
Yeah, which basically there were like 800 wholesalers spread around the United States. Some of them handled as much as like half of a state. Many of them handled territories like 1/4 of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of them were businesses that were basically six guys and 6 station wagons, and whose basic job was just getting periodicals and newspapers and some paperbacks into spinning racks and wire racks and so forth and so on. And the nationalization of these chains and the application of lots of much more rigorous inventory IT basically caused a sort of spiral of these wholesalers merging with each other. I mean, supposedly, at least according to Tom Doherty, who's the founder of Tor, it started in the Puget Sound area with Safeway saying to the 12 wholesalers it dealt with between Olympia and Bellingham, Washington, we don't want to deal with 12 wholesalers. You guys figure it out. We want to deal with one of you. The others should sell to the other.
And they said, we can't do that. We bid for territories. And they said, we're taking bids.
Yeah, well, exactly. We're Safeway. You can do what we say.
And the winner gave them a couple of extra points of profitability.
So the net results of this is that as of now, there's like one wholesaler in the country, ReaderLink, that basically supplies what paperbacks actually do get into non-bookstore outlets, and it's a very constrained list.
You're missing a connection there, which is that because they gave away profitability and book distribution was already a very marginal business, they started going out of business. So they just merged into each other. As they collapsed.
So it's while it was going on, I remember Teresa observing it's sort of like watching the monasteries disappear under Henry VIII. There's a vast quantity of knowledge on the ground that's just going away as these companies sell to each other, and bunches of people who've been doing this for decades very skillfully, they all retire. And you'd see that the stupidification of paperback distribution happening also in the 90s. While writers and readers and literary people are all wringing their hands over the terrible Barnes & Noble, which at that time was growing enormously. This was the real disaster that was going on. In fact, the growth of Barnes & Noble was actually a kind of counterweight to this and kept a lot of authors' careers going. Because the thing is that mass market paperbacks were always a very tiny appendix to the enormous business of getting copies of Playboy and TV Guide up into all those grocery shelves. If you are a gigantic colossus that has suddenly come into being and is responsible for like 7 Western states distribution, and you know, the people who still have jobs are people who 10 minutes ago were running you know, the equivalent of 1/4 of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And the fact that
Yeah,
they've
yeah.
taken over all this new territory doesn't mean
You're
that they
gonna-
actually have capital to deal with it.
or mental capital or mental bandwidth. You're gonna look at ways you can simplify your job, and that's why in the 1990s this incredibly diverse ecology of the distribution of mass market paperbacks simplified into what was called famous author distribution, where, you know, you'd have a much smaller wire rack in the grocery store and would have like six huge, you know, one stripe per major author: Stephen King, Richard North Patterson, whatever. This is actually even before, you know, Harry Potter and so forth. So it's a terrible story that I basically set forth to point out just how many massive market failures there are in modern American, you know, literary and intellectual publishing, et cetera, life. That, you know, the vast changes in who gets offered what, who gets to buy what, who gets to look at what, that have nothing to do with anything anybody actually wanted. My concern is not about the health of the art. It's more about the health of the society. The fact that we really are simply turning our backs on and walking away from those 50% of American families that from the kids in those families. The grown-ups, they've made their choices. I'm not worried about them, but it's their offspring that bothers me. Because I remember being a you know, nine-year-old who was fantastically affected by the ability to buy, you know, 11-year-old buy a huge range of things for 95 cents in grocery stores. It was a tremendous cultural benefit that has just evaporated for no good reason.
Well, the scale of mass promotes a kind of homogeneity. This is what we're.
Well, that's the thing, is that the golden age of the mass market paperback did not promote homogeneity. It promoted a vast diversity. It was when it was consolidated into
the scale
tiny,
of consolidated.
Yeah,
mass.
exactly. Yeah,
I don't think that you get the same number of sales.
Yeah.
I think that more people read when there's that greater variety. Something's going to catch their eye. But when it collapses in, when you get a smaller number of choices, fewer people buy fewer books or comics or magazines or music, for that matter.
Yeah.
It's worth saying that there are sort of there's a history of social science research that goes into these kinds of questions about diversity of readership and the different ways in which communities, often not metropolitan communities, but out you know, in second-order cities and things like that, pick up what varieties of textual material there are and make, as it were, culture out of them. And this sorry? And to some extent, it's a literature that seems to exist in a kind of perpetual present, and nobody's really written very much about its development and its internal sort of evolution of research strategies. But I think one of the interesting source points for it actually is a moment in the mid-20th century, running from roughly, I would say, the late 30s to the late 50s, when there was this kind of concern, almost a cultural panic, about something like the demoralizing effects of mass circulation paperbacks combined with things like comics and also tabloid newspapers, which went through their peak production period in the mid-20th century. So in the UK, where I come from, newspapers were sold in absolutely phenomenal amounts in the mid-20th century. And there was this moment of concern that working class audiences especially might be seeing a dramatic homogenization of their culture, because it was thought by academics essentially that they were reading like pulp fiction, comics, tabloid newspapers, and nothing else.